My name is Patrick Kelly. I'm the Director of Education at Stokes Nature Center, and very excited to be doing another Digital Canyon conversation with you all today. Today's talk is going to be about some rules for wild foraging and wild harvesting of our many abundant medicinal edibles and other just tasty plants that we have out here in Utah and in our Cache National Forest. And I'll be going through some of the rules that are really introductory for getting your feet wet in terms of looking for some of our native edible plants that we can eat out in the wild, and then how do we go about that in a responsible way. So I'm very happy to be talking to you about that today. So first is, what is foraging? So foraging simply is just a collection of wild foods or medicines from the land. And a lot of different people and a lot of different populations forage or have foraged. First of all of our ancestors. We've only had standardized agriculture for about 10,000 years, and yet our species has been around a lot longer than that. And so each and every single one of us, we have someone in our bloodline who was a subsistence forager. There are many populations today, both in the United States and outside the United States, that are subsistence users. Many Native American peoples and cultures, both traditionally and currently, are still subsistence users and utilized wild foraging. Foodies, enthusiasts, certain religious practitioners, and more. And so what we're going to be going over today is we're going to be learning about the harvesting of these wild plants. We're going to learn why we would want to harvest wild plants, where we could potentially harvest these, how to harvest and safely harvest wild plants, and then finally we're going to go over some really introductory species in terms of what we can harvest out right now in our early spring. We're also going to be learning a little bit about the rules and regulations concerning harvesting on public lands, focusing on our national forest, because that is our most accessible resource for wild edibles and forageable plants. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to learn some really just basic plants to start off with. A lot of these you'll have seen. Maybe we're putting some names to some familiar faces. Maybe we're just going to be showing you some new uses that you can see whenever you spot one of these guys out in the wild, or even sometimes on your lawn or elsewhere. So first, why would we want to harvest wild plants? Well, two main reasons is for traditional medicines, and then for food. And what I mean by traditional medicines is medicines or uses for these plants that have some sort of benefit to us in small or moderate quantities. So a lot of different medicines traditionally do come from plants. Aspirin comes from the genus Salix, and those are all from willows. And then morphine famously comes from poppies. And there's a lot of other ones out there that are naturally occurring. Other medicinal uses plants have, antiseptic, antibacterial, and anti-inflammatory properties are found in yarrows when either used in a tea moderately or applied directly to a wound. Arnica, when applied externally, relieves bruising and increases blood flow, and those are really popular, but only taken externally, so put on the skin, never ingested. But what about food? You think about agriculture, and the corn that we grow is indigenous to the United States, but that started off as a wild plant and slowly was cultivated and turned into the species it is today. So in terms of food, there's so much wild food out there. Think about all the different animals that live out in our national forest. They're not participating in agriculture. They are doing their own wild harvesting. And so a lot of what we have out there is edible, but not everything is edible for humans. So we're going to go over a few of those. There's a lot of different parts you can eat from plants. The roots, the leaves, flowers, stems, berries, cones, saps, even more, obviously depending on what species of plant it is. Not every part of every plant is palatable or even enjoyable to eat. And we do have some poisonous plants out in our national forest, so always, always, always make sure you have a very positive ID or identification of a plant before you try it in any sort of way. Um, Dandelions are a very versatile food. I look everywhere and it's just littered with dandelions. So we're going to learn a little bit about dandelions as food. Um, we do have wild onions, wild potatoes, wild strawberries, wild celeries. Again, all these things are out there that we can harvest for subsistence use if we do it well and we know what we are harvesting and how to prepare it. So as I mentioned, where do you think our cultivated foods began? They began as wild creatures. I think of them as wild animals, kind of like when we had aurochs before we had wild cattle, or when we had wild sheep before we domesticated Eurasian sheep. So they were out there naturally occurring, and it was just people using practices, a behavior we had discovered or invented in order to take some of those seeds and put them in an organized pattern so that it's a reliable food source. But otherwise, they're all out there naturally occurring. So where can you harvest these plants? First of all, you can harvest a lot of them in your own backyard if your backyard hasn't been seeded with any herbicide or pesticide or things like that that could do harm to us internally. A great example of those are dandelions. I know I have lots of friends with backyards that are just littered with dandelions. And so that's a really great source, again, as long as there's no contaminants. And then this is just a really long list of other plants that we have out here in Utah, whether up in the mountains or down in the foothills, that you can use as food sources. Again, make sure you have a positive identification before doing anything with these potential foods. You can also harvest in the national forest, but that gets a little bit trickier because it is a public land, and so you need to go through a special process in order to legally be able to harvest out there. So harvesting plants in a national forest, I'm going to move my little box window really quick. Technically, in order to harvest, even for non-commercial use, that means for personal use. Commercial use would be like you go out, you gather a bunch of stuff, and then you sell it. You absolutely cannot do that in a national forest without special permitting. But even for non-commercial use, for personal use, you do still need a permit to harvest. That includes food resources, like those we'll be going over, as well as firewood. We all know we need our Christmas tree permits before we can go out into the forest and cut down a Christmas tree, and then also transplants for home gardens. But not every forest requires a permit for all collection or harvest practices. The Uinta Wasatch Cache does require a permit, but you don't need a permit if you're in an emergency for survival or living a lifestyle as legally defined as a prospector, homesteader, or pioneer. And so if you happen to fit that definition, or you're out there in an emergency situation, you don't need to file the necessary paperwork before going about and making sure that you're able to sustain yourself in those kinds of situations or lifestyles. So then how do we harvest plants? It may seem intuitive, but there are some best practices that we definitely want to use whenever we're going out and harvesting. The first is to really consider the context. Where is that plant? What is happening around it? So is a plant bountiful? There's just fields and fields of bluebells. Are they meager? There's a few here and there, or are they rare? We don't want to harvest in situations where those plants are meager or rare for that plant type. We don't want to do adverse damage to the ability for that plant to continue to propagate and live in its naturally occurring environment. You also have to ask yourself, will my harvest potentially benefit the plant or others around it? Think about it as kind of like pruning a tree. You need to prune a tree so that it knows where to pool its resources. And also, if you see just lots and lots of bluebells, they're going to be competing against each other. So it's not going to necessarily harm the plant to thin it out a little bit, and it could benefit other plants around it. Next question we want to ask is, where is this plant expending its energy? Which is another way of asking, what season is it preparing for? Is it the fall and it's getting ready to go to seed, and so it's sending all of its nutrients and sugars into making sure that it can survive So going back down into that taproot if it's perennial, or going into a really strong seeding behavior if it's just trying to get seed out. If it's spring, it's trying to put out flowers so it can get ready for the pollination season. If it's early spring, they're going to be focusing on putting out leaves so that they can start to photosynthesize. And so that's also going to direct us where we want to harvest from that plant. So if it's spring and those leaves are really young and soft and palatable, we might want to be harvesting those leaves. If it's the fall and the seeds or the berries are the edible portion of that plant, that's a good place to be harvesting. But you're not going to want to be harvesting the leaves in the late summer when they're kind of bitter and really quite developed, because it's putting its energy somewhere else. And so you don't want to take away that existing structure for it. And then, of course, can I harvest what I need without damaging the environment? If you see a really beautiful patch of harvestable plants, but you see delicate soils or cryptobiotic soil in your way, maybe don't travel over that cryptobiotic soil. You don't want to do more damage to the environment by going out and collecting these. And then finally, or not finally, but also collect only what you need and in moderation. You might have the tendency to say, well, I'm going to definitely use all of these bits of sage because I want to be, I've got a big, piece of meat. I want to use wild sage to add spice to it. I need lots of sage. Consider moderation. You usually need less than what you harvest, especially if it's for personal use and non-commercial use. So really only take what you're going to need in the immediate future, or that you can use, that you can store very easily without depleting that resource or affecting it in a negative manner. And then always harvest away from potential contaminants. So roads, trails, etc. So especially where there may be pesticides or herbicides, perhaps where there's a lot of domestic animals or animals out to pasture, you want to harvest away from there because there might be contaminants in there. So making sure that the area is more or less free from any sort of contamination that could adversely affect you. And then finally, don't over-harvest year to year. If you have a really solid patch of bluebells, don't go there every single year and deplete that supply. Just like with agricultural fields, sometimes we just need to let things go fallow, and fallow out in the wild has a very different meaning. It's just letting the natural processes take place. And then also, if you have a really good blueberry patch, or where there's some really great raspberries, don't spill the beans on those good sites. Keep them within a close circle of friends who also follow these best practices, because if someone hears but doesn't necessarily understand how to harvest in moderation or why that's important, they might go out, they might take all the flowers of the bluebells, and then those bluebells can't propagate, and then there aren't going to be more bluebells that are spreading and continuing that bountiful site. So making sure that those you're sharing with also follow the proper behaviors and proper ethics. So then what can we harvest when we're out in the national forest? First of all, and rule number one always, is only harvest what you know and can positively identify. If you don't know what it is, leave it alone. Take a picture, go home, positively ID it at home, and then perhaps go back if you can see an immediate personal use for the harvesting of that plant. And that really ties into really only harvest what you know you'll use. Because these plants are naturally occurring and out in the wild, and they have to survive out there even in the winters, it's a hard life for them. So only harvest what you know you'll use, and again, in moderation. And lastly, only harvest healthy plants. If you're out in an agricultural field or out in an orchard and you saw an apple that was covered in kind of like gross looking spots, maybe it's got a kind of scale to it, you wouldn't necessarily harvest that apple. Same with plants. So if the plant looks sick, leave it alone, let nature take its course. Don't worry about harvesting that unhealthy plant if you're going to be using it for your own personal use. And finally, I can't emphasize this enough, if you can't positively identify something, take a picture of it, look it up at home, and then find it again later. And again, never ever harvest something that you're unsure of. That's very, very important. You can get very sick eating the wrong things. So while it's a lot of fun to go out and sample wild foods, make sure you know what you're getting yourself into and you know exactly what you're harvesting. So a good guidebook, nothing beats an experienced naturalist or guide going along with you, and then your own personal research. So I'm going to get into some common plants we might start off, some common plants we might see out in the National Forest. I'm going to start with plants you absolutely should not harvest. And in general, purple flowered plants are bad. They're beautiful to look at, but you don't want to interact with them, especially in a subsistence way. So in general, purple flowered plants are off limits. If I ever see a purple flower plant, I don't know what it is. I don't mess with it. I'll take a picture. It's beautiful. Identify it later. But more often than not, it's going to be pretty deadly, or at least not good for you. Many of them are some of the most poisonous plants we have out in our national forests, such as monkshood or its cousin larkspur. These are powerful neurotoxins, and they can do adverse damage to our neurological systems. Others can make you really sick, such as lupins, a lot of different wild peas, and then some chamises. Some, like monkshood, are even considered dangerous to touch. So again, take a picture, admire its beauty, but don't interact with it. Know that, there's certain species of bees that are interacting with it. There's certain species of other pollinators, but they're just not for people. And then again, please don't pick, eat, or harvest purple flowered plants. Leave it where it is. Again, take a picture, continue your lovely non-poisoned day. So now that I've given that disclaimer to some things you should not do, I'm going to start talking about some plants you can start to look for, and if you feel confident in your identification, start to harvest responsibly. And the first, dandelions. They're prolific. They're all over the place. Each head can produce up to 200 seeds at a time, and a single plant like this will produce up to 5,000 seeds in a year. That's a very, very voraciously reproducing plant. And so when we see these and we want to harvest them, again, because they are common in some of our highly trafficked areas, make sure there aren't possible contaminants around first. But when you do harvest, you can harvest every single part of a dandelion. The roots you can grind into a caffeine-free coffee substitute or eat it like a carrot. The leaves, when they're really young, are really great in salads because they're not yet bitter, but they do have a little bit of that bitterness and astringency. And then the flowers, you can either fry them up, or you can make a sun tea where you just plop off the heads, you put them in a jar full of water, and you just set it out in the sun, and it'll slowly steep. Dandelions are pretty good for you as well, though the vitamin levels are pretty small. They are high in calcium and vitamin C, especially in the leaves, and then many minerals and vitamins, including A, your B range, vitamin C, and then the roots also are heavy in vitamin D. Our next plant that we can harvest out are bluebells, also known as chiming bells or lungworts. These are one of my favorite snacks. The lungwort name refers to its traditional medicinal use. So the leaf, folks thought looked like a lung, and so hence its use, lungwort. And I do like the leaves in teas and things like that, especially when they're young. When you do harvest, I really like the flowers. These flowers, they taste like cucumbers when they're mature, so I just will take the flower off of that stem. You can see how they kind of droop in that bunch there, and they taste really great. I've seen folks take them and put them in a jar of water, so it's kind of like cucumber water, but floral. And then the leaves used in teas, or again, young leaves in salads. Definitely look these guys up. They're out right now. They're just starting to bloom, and so these guys are out there in our national forest. The next, which we see lots of and is very, very common are our sages and our sagebrush. There's lots and lots and lots of different species, but they all can basically be used for taking those leaves and using them as a spice. Like I mentioned, I like to put sage if I'm out camping. I'll throw some in my macaroni and cheese or in whatever I'm cooking up. Or you can also use it in tea, and it helps with constipation and sore throats. So they are really tasty. When you use it as a spice, when you do use it as a medicinal, it can be a little bit overpowering and pungent. So if you take a bit of that sagebrush and you crush it and you rub it in your hands and smell it, imagine drinking that. It definitely tastes like medicine. Yarrow, I'll move my little window so you can see it. Yarrow is a really powerful medicinal. It's been used as medicine for thousands of years, and it comes from the genus Achillea. And I've heard two different legends about Achilles and these yarrow. So one legend is that Achilles, the famous warrior of Greek legend, used to use yarrow to heal the wounds of his soldiers in battle. So he'd take the leaves, crush them up, pack them in the wounds, and they're anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, and help those wounds heal faster. The other legend I've heard is that his mother, in order to bless him when he was a child, held him and dipped him in a vat of yarrow tea, but she had to hold him by the heel, which is why that's the only part of him that wasn't protected. So later when Paris shot him with an arrow, that's the place it went, through his heel, that only place that wasn't protected by that yarrow tea. When you're choosing to harvest yarrow, it's another one of those plants where almost every single part of it has a use. So the flowers, you can use it in teas. It's been said to help with fevers and colds. The leaves, like I mentioned, are great for helping to promote clotting, or use for if you have a small scratch or laceration. Also antibacterial, anti-inflammatory. And then the roots are one of my favorite parts. They're just kind of fun. So if I find yarrow and it looks like a harvestable specimen, I'll dig it up and I'll take that root and I'll clean it off and I'll start chewing on it. If you chew on a big root for a bit, it starts to numb your mouth. It's pretty funny. It's kind of like a funny tingling in your mouth and tongue. And it's good if you have a toothache or have any sort of dental pain, just to chew that guy up. So I just want to end by thanking everyone for tuning in to our digital canning conversation. We'll have another one in 2 weeks' time. And I really hope that you've learned something great today about some of our common plants: bluebell, sages, dandelions, yarrow. And so I invite you to keep your eyes out. Please always remember to take photos to positively identify later if you're unsure of plants in order to stay safe. And then have fun out there and happy harvesting. I do hope you'll check us out online at logannature.org. And if you have any questions, feel free to send us an email at nature@logannature.org. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.